Thank you, Dr. Petkoff, and thank you all for arranging this, particularly Bruderhof Communities. I'm grateful. For the past 24 years, my team and I have been working mostly in Myanmar and the surrounding countries, helping in the ethnic states where either forced displacement, ethnic cleansing, or outright genocide has been taking place, largely in the pursuit of natural resources or the control of those resources. You may know that the Myanmar Army is the 12th largest conventional army on the planet and is run not against external enemies, but is run in the pursuit of control of these resources and power. In 2012, you may remember attacks making the news in Rakhine State, in the city of Sittwe. Those attacks didn't happen in a vacuum, and they warrant discussion this morning. When I think about religious persecution, I'm not only thinking about Christian persecution or freedom, I'm thinking about the freedom a human being should have to choose their faith and express it. In 2012, it is alleged that a Rohingya person brutally raped a Buddhist young girl in Rakhine State just outside of Sittwe. In reprisal for that, a mob of native Rakhine people stopped a bus on its way to a pilgrimage to the Hajj to go to Mecca and brutally dismembered and killed everyone on that bus. After that, there were other various reprisals, and it's largely believed by the communities, the aid organizations, and the political watchdogs of this, the human rights organizations, that this was state-sponsored violence. State-sponsored violence in order to provoke sectarian violence. State-sponsored violence in order to provoke two major religious groups to war and to harm one another. The riots that happened after that resulted in 150,000 people being forced into a floodplain just outside of the city of Sittwe and surrounded by barbed wire and protecting state authorities. Every single person that we interviewed after that violence, as we were going there to help them survive this acute crisis, every single person said that the riots were not Buddhists versus Muslims. The riots were mixed with state police and army soldiers who were provoking the burning down of these Rohingya homes, who were provoking the terrible atrocities that are well documented as a part of that event. We interviewed one woman named Masuda, and I'd like to tell you briefly her story just to illustrate what they went through because of this state-sponsored violence. Masuda is a part of a fishing family. When the violence broke out and they were being forced from their homes, her and her 49 relatives got on a fishing boat and made their way down a small tributary towards the ocean where they were hoping to find safety. Attacking and rioting mobs followed them, saw their ship, got in a smaller boat and set into this river, attached their boat to this larger boat, and proceeded to kill the relatives of Masuda one by one in the most brutal ways, mostly with knives and swords. Masuda jumped out of the ship while she was watching one of her granddaughters be molested and killed and grabbed onto something that was floating. They were in the process of sinking this fishing vessel. The last thing she remembers is seeing the flash of her family being killed, while she was hanging onto a floating object, she passed out. She was drugged from the water downriver and miraculously survived. That night, all 49 of her relatives, including her husband and her 5 children, were killed in the most brutal ways. When we interviewed her and her only surviving relative, who was a young grandson, I don't remember how he survived, when we interviewed them, she kept screaming and saying that she heard the ghosts of her family, and she would walk down to the water each night to try to put to rest these terrible, traumatizing emotions that she was feeling. The violence continued through the years from 2012 up until last August, and you may remember on August 25th seeing images in our newspapers of 17 villages that were on fire. The villages that were set fire were not because of rioting Rakhine people. Some of them participated, but this violence was initiated by state police and the Myanmar army. Those 17 villages over the months turned into more than 300 cases of villages being destroyed, and the stories that we heard and documented as we received these fleeing civilians in Bangladesh were those that were referenced in the first panel. These are well-documented stories of the worst type. And now Reuters News just documented the hundreds of thousands, in fact, of children that are being born right now in Bangladesh because of the policy of systematic rape that is encouraged among the armed forces and the police in Myanmar. You don't have to dig deep to see that religion is used as a means of division. Religion is used as a means to divide these people from one another. For as long as the Karen people in Western Burma or Eastern Burma have been resisting the regime, more than 50 years, the regime has used the premise of keeping peace between Buddhists and Muslims and folk religion practitioners as a reason to go in and burn down villages and do these terrible things that are well documented. Our team, our small team in Partners Relief and Development, have been involved in this violence, involved in helping the victims since 1994. In 2012, the only way to help the victims that were surrounded by barbed wire was to go into that camp subversively. I met one USAID official and talked to him about more substantial funding because the numbers were overwhelming. And the funding couldn't be given to us because we weren't willing to negotiate an MOU with the very body doing the killing. And that's the Myanmar regime. And that is also the reason that we're still there, but none of those other large agencies are there. And the projects that the Myanmar regime approved for them to do were only symbolic and small. And the logos that were allowed to be placed on buildings that have stayed locked since 2012, the clinics that were established to supposedly care for the Rohingya, none of them actually functioned except on the days of monitoring and evaluation. And it was all a mockery of justice and humanity. My point with that story is that our interaction with Myanmar has to consider the fact that the regime is guilty of the crime that I'm talking about. The regime is doing the killing and has marginalized these people. And Masuda and her overwhelming number of kin who suffer because of this ongoing systematic denial of justice, they suffer in part because of our policies, our foreign policies, and our approach to this country and the conflicts that are going on there, and our geopolitical and economic interests. It warrants reflection. 3 days ago, I was in Aleppo and with an assessment team looking at projects that our team has initiated 3 years ago and has continued to run through the 3 years of war in all of the major cities in Syria. We were asked by the government in Kurdish Syria to help children whose families have been killed or who have witnessed such traumatic events that they are dysfunctioning, both in school and in family or in society. I asked if I could meet some of those children so that I could get a better handle on who we're talking about and the ages of these kids. And they took me to visit 3 siblings and their grandmother who survived what they say is an ISIS attack in the city of Kobani. Kobani is a city of over 1 million people where 80% of the buildings were flattened by ISIS, and all of the terrible atrocities that have been considered or documented as acts of war happened. I walked into this compound and first met the grandmother, who pointed to her nose, which was half missing, and she said that when ISIS came into our home, first they brutally killed my daughter, then they brutally killed her husband, my son-in-law, and that happened in front of these 3 children, their mother and father. Then they shot me in the nose. I fell over, and they shot me again in the hip, and she pulled her skirt up so I could see the bullet wound on her hip. She told me this while she was weeping, 76-year-old woman who had already told this story to journalists. And one of her reflections is, what good is it to tell you what happened when you will leave also and we will still be hungry? The fighters, thinking that the grandmother was dead, then turned their attention to the siblings. They attempted to remove the left leg of the youngest sibling, a little girl who was 9 months old. They attempted to remove her left leg with a knife. They stopped halfway through this terrible process for reasons I don't know. But this little girl is left now with a permanent disability and a scar to prove the violence that happened to her. Then they went to the oldest sibling, another girl who was 3 years old, and they cut her pinky off with a knife. For some reason, they left the boy untouched. They turned around and they left the apartment. This helps all of us understand the human story, the narrative behind the metrics of war, and the brutality of these terror groups as they use religion as a means to destroy both pluralistic society and the harmony that was experienced in this country before the war. Of course, there were massive divides and problems, especially between the Sunnis and the Shiites. But largely, they lived as neighbors in a state of neighborly friendliness. I was told by many people in Syria that behind their suffering are the weapons and the training of the United States. And it broke my heart. When I thought that it was al-Nusra doing the killing, or ISIS doing the killing, I even went on camera to tell people about what was happening. I was corrected after my interview that no, this wasn't ISIS, this was Nusra. And all of the villagers in this destroyed village agreed that it was Nusra. And when they pointed out the destruction of their life and livelihood, they said that it's not just al-Nusra, it's US weapons and training, it's Saudi, it's Qatar and their allies. And so when I was invited while on my way to Syria by Bruderhof, I felt that I don't have that much to contribute because I don't work in this space of diplomacy or foreign policy. I work in the space of political complexity and violence to feed children who are starving, something that all of us could raise our hands and participate in. I know that. But then I thought being invited to this podium and being a voice at this place was important. I met hundreds of Syrian Christians who reached out to me, who sacrificially served their Shiite and their Sunni neighbors, who talked about a return to the pluralistic society that they once enjoyed in major cities like Aleppo and Homs and Damascus, who talked about the power of reconciliation and forgiveness and exercised it, who were sacrificially in front of me organizing feeding kitchens for Shiites who were released outside of Idlib just 4 days ago. I watched it all happen, and I watched their attitude that was overwhelmingly seasoned with love. And for me, when I think about the answer to the world's problems, to the wars that we're facing, that we're confronted with today, and even foreign policy, as naive as it sounds, we should have some common sense and be overwhelmingly motivated by love. Thank you very much.